as we alluded to when we talked about the overall arrangement of the endocrine system and the function of so many of the hormones, we talked about that there was a hierarchy of control between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and other glands. Essentially, everything the hypothalamus does with respect to endocrine function is to control pituitary secretions. The pituitary, in turn, goes on to show several examples of hormonal control of other glands. So we get this three-tiered axis of control. As we look at this particular section, that's what we're going to be focusing on. We're going to understand the two different mechanisms by which the hypothalamus communicates with the pituitary. We're going to try and understand this hierarchy of control that exists between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and other glandular tissues. And in particular, we're going to focus on the thyroid gland. Not that that one's any more important than others, but it's a common one that a lot of people are aware of, thyroidisms. And essentially, once you understand the functioning of that particular feedback loop, you can substitute in any other third-tier gland, like the adrenal glands with cortisol or some of the gonadal endocrine tissues, and you will see the same pattern of control. So we have to understand that negative feedback mechanism, a stimulatory effect down the axis of the glands, and then a negative feedback back to the originating glands. As we alluded to, there was going to be two mechanisms by which the hypothalamus interacts with the pituitary. And they're very regional with respect to the pituitary. We see a communication mechanism between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, we see the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Now, from a terminology perspective, obviously you can see where the hypothalamo comes from. That's pretty straightforward. The hypophyseal, however, comes from an older term for the pituitary called the hypophysis. So if you're wondering where that term comes from, there it is. Let's look at the tract first. Remember, the posterior pituitary wasn't glandular tissue. We see the posterior pituitary being a storage location for two hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus. Antidiuretic hormone, which I'm sure you're sick of hearing about by now, and oxytocin. Both of those hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary. So way back when we, well, not way back, but last week when we talked about what an endocrine gland is, we said we had to check two boxes. It had to produce a hormone, and it had to secrete that hormone into the blood. We needed to meet both of those criteria to call something an endocrine gland. And the anterior pituitary checked both of those boxes all by itself. However, once we got to the posterior pituitary, technically speaking, we kind of have to encircle part of the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary as one glandular structure in order to check both of those boxes. We got our production from the hypothalamus, and we got our secretion into the blood occurring from the posterior pituitary. The hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract is modified neural tissue. Now, you'll have to think back to when we studied neurons way back when. Remember, we had the cell body, and then we had those projections extending from it. The longer, usually singular projection leaving the cell body was called the axon. And we talked an awful lot about voltage changes, sending an action potential down the axon. So we get an electrical conduction. What we didn't talk much about was a process called axoplasmic flow. If you picture that axon acting like a tube, we can shuttle various substances up and down that tube. So we can produce a product in the cell body and shuttle it down the axon and secreted from the axon terminal, not much different than what we did for neurotransmitter release, at the posterior pituitary. It gets stored in the posterior pituitary until it's time to dump it into the blood. So we talk about this hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. That is going to be modified neural tissue, only associated with the posterior pituitary, and it's essentially a passageway for ADH and oxytocin that are produced in the hypothalamus to be stored in that posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, obviously, it is a lot more extensive when it comes to the number of hormones it produces, and this is where we start to get our control over other glands. We see any number of glands or hormones secreted into the blood that will then go on to affect other glandular tissue, like the thyroid gland, the adrenal cortex, the liver, the gonadal tissues. So in this way, most of our hierarchy of control is going to be from the hypothalamus through the anterior pituitary and then onto other glandular tissues. Now, the communication that the hypothalamus has with the anterior pituitary is quite a bit different than the posterior. We describe the posterior as neural extensions. The reason the hypothalamus in and of itself can be glandular tissue is that, number one, again, it produces a hormone, and number two, it secretes it into the circulatory system. This communication we have with the anterior pituitary is circulatory. The hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system is a modified circulatory connection. Now, we talked a lot about secreting hormones into the blood. They go throughout the circulatory system, looking for any cell that happens to have a receptor for that hormone. In the case of these particular hormones, the only cells that are going to have a receptor for it are right at the anterior pituitary. That's their job. That's where they have to go. And of course, they're only a couple inches away. Now, for efficiency's sake, why would we dump a hormone into the blood at the hypothalamus and let it circulate the whole way through the body before it gets to the anterior pituitary just a couple inches away? That wouldn't make much sense. So we get this modified circulatory connection. It makes all the difference. Like if we were hopping on a bus to go 3 blocks over, and instead of taking us directly there, the bus would take us all the way around town first. No, you'd want a bus that picked you up where you were and brought you straight to your location. That's what the portal system does for the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And it's by this means that any hormones we get coming from the hypothalamus in this regard are truly making the hypothalamus glandular tissue. These are hormones. They're dumped into the blood at their release. They drift, next stop, anterior pituitary, and they influence those anterior pituitary secretions. And it's by this way that we get that 3 hierarchy glandular control. The hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary controls a 3rd gland. Now, in this case, we said we're going to focus on the thyroid. Great example of it. Let's kind of go to a simpler diagram. The hypothalamus produces thyrotropic releasing hormone, which hops into our hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, goes directly to the anterior pituitary. Its presence at the anterior pituitary causes the anterior pituitary to release more thyroid stimulating hormone, which goes into the blood, makes its way to the thyroid gland, causing the thyroid gland to secrete more thyroid hormone, T3, T4. Not calcitonin, T3, T4. Then that thyroid hormone would go out to our target cells and elicit that metabolic change that we expect from it. This is a stimulatory axis. Secretions from the hypothalamus increase production from the pituitary. Those secretions from the pituitary go on to increase production and secretion at the thyroid. But we have a negative feedback control. As thyroid hormones in the blood get to a certain level, we see feedback to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to inhibit further secretions. So by doing this, we see thyroid hormones undergo this slight fluctuation with regard to its circulatory levels. At times when it's at its lowest, we see increased stimulation coming from above because those low levels of thyroid hormone will not have much of an inhibitory effect. This in turn increases our thyroid production. Once that thyroid production gets to a certain amplitude, so to speak, certain level in the blood, now we see an increased degree of negative feedback, which turns off the hypothalamus and the pituitary secretions, decreasing further production of the thyroid gland, and we see levels start to drop again. Very typical, straightforward negative feedback control. By the time all is said and done, we will have looked at 3 specific examples of hormonal feedback control. This is our first. This is our simplest. The next 2 that we will look at in detail are going to involve the male and female reproductive systems. And as we go from the thyroid example to our male reproductive and then on to our female reproductive, we will see this feedback pattern get increasingly sophisticated. A little bit more nuanced, a little bit more activity going on. So now what we get here when we look at this 3 axes of control is various areas where things can go wrong. If you recall from our last lecture, some of the slides had the word cause and it was left blank. Cushing syndrome, Addison syndrome were 2 examples. Because the things that could increase or decrease those particular hormones coming from this 3rd tier of our control could be because of a disorder in that particular gland, or it could be a problem further up the chain with respect to control. And because of this, we can introduce a couple of new phenomena called primary or secondary hormonal imbalances. Sticking with the thyroid, if we have a primary thyroidism, a primary hyperthyroidism, or a primary hypothyroidism, the designation of the word primary to that disorder indicates that it's a thyroid problem, first and foremost. Something in those follicular cells of the thyroid have gone awry, and we're seeing either an increase, unwanted production of thyroid hormone, or we're seeing a decreased ability to produce those hormones. A primary disorder, that's a thyroid disorder. It could be a tumor in the thyroid gland. It could be an autoimmune disorder that has attacked the thyroid. It could be cystic activity in the thyroid gland. Whatever the case may be, if you have a primary hyperthyroidism, that is a problem at the thyroid gland. And regardless of what feedback is coming from above, we're seeing a continued pumping out of thyroid hormones. If we have a primary hypothyroidism, it doesn't matter how much is being stimulated from above. We simply cannot get this thyroid gland to work because the problem resides in the thyroid. Secondary disorders implies that the gland in question is perfectly healthy. It's just doing what it's told. So now we can have a secondary hyperthyroidism, where we have increase in thyroid hormones simply because TSH has increased. A pituitary tumor, for example, pumps out TSH at crazy high levels. Thyroid gland's just doing what it's told. It's still a hyperthyroidism because it still has an excess thyroid hormones being circulating, but it's not primary. Thyroid gland's healthy. It's the pituitary gland that has the disease, therefore making the thyroidism, it's a secondary designation. Now we will see blood levels of these various hormones fluctuate, and we can use those primary versus secondary disorders as an example to exemplify the feedback mechanisms. Because of feedback control, under normal situations, if thyroid hormone is high, we would expect the other two to be low. Under normal situations, if thyroid levels were low, we would expect the other two to be high in order to kickstart it, so to speak. As we look at this chain of events, we do see this amplification. And for most of you listening to this, if you've had some blood work done looking for a thyroid disorder, yes, they do look at your thyroid hormone levels, but they actually focus more on your TSH levels. Because if the thyroid hormone is just a little high, TSH will be almost non-existent in the blood. If thyroid hormone is just a little low, you see a multiple fold increase in TSH. So a little change at the thyroid gland results in larger changes with pituitary secretions. So these are a little easier to see on blood work and make an accurate interpretation out of what's exactly going on. So if we were to have a primary hyperthyroidism, diseases in the thyroid producing an increased thyroid hormone, what would we expect TSH and TRH levels to be if it was a primary hyperthyroidism? We would expect secretion of TSH to be low, and we'd expect secretion of TRH to be low. But the high thyroid persists because the thyroid gland simply can't turn off. Primary hypothyroidisms, again, disorders in the thyroid gland, we would expect to see ridiculously high levels of TSH and TRH. This thyroid gland is no longer under the control from above for primary hyper or hypo. It's doing whatever its particular disease is leaning it towards doing. Now, if we have a secondary, we kind of have to be a little specific as to where the disorder is. Let's say there's a pituitary tumor increasing TSH levels. That would give us a secondary hyperthyroidism. What would we expect TRH levels to be in this case? That increased thyroid is going to negatively feed back, and we would expect TRH levels to be low. So if we're getting into secondary, you kind of have to identify where the issue is to get into what we would think various hormonal levels would wind up being. But just remember, normal situations have a typical feedback control. If the thyroid gland has a primary disorder, it is no longer taking orders from the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Whatever its dysfunction is leading it to do, it does regardless of the control mechanism. But of course, under normal situations, we see TRH, TSH increase or decrease its production in order to give the thyroid output needed, which is why we would get that slight sinusoidal wave. But before we clue up, again, we focused on the thyroid as a single example. But we could still keep the hypothalamus and the pituitary in our schematic at a third glandular tissue. Remember, there could be the adrenal cortex, for example, with cortisol. We obviously see different hormones involved, but we see the same mechanism of negative feedback. For when our end organs get to be a certain elevation in blood level, the controlling glands decrease their secretions. And we would still see the same primary or secondary type of disorders, depending on if we had an imbalance where the dysfunction lay in that particular axis of control. So as you're studying this material, first and foremost, get the communication system down. Make sure you know which hormones are coming from which gland, hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract versus the portal system. Then start to focus on the feedback mechanisms. I encourage you to use the thyroid gland first because it is the most straightforward one we can present. Understand how there's a stimulatory secretion from hypothalamus to pituitary to thyroid. But that end organ, in this case, the thyroid, its secretion goes back to inhibit secretions from the two higher glands. And by this way, we get to regulate hormonal secretion from the thyroid. We'll touch back on this feedback mechanism again, but it's important to have a foundation with it first before we move on to the more sophisticated examples. So by the time we finish up our reproductive physiology and a hormonal control there, you'll have seen two other examples of feedback control with respect to the hypothalamus and the pituitary. As usual, if you have any questions, please let me know.